returning to the hard problem of consciousness, and where I think the heart of the philosophical debate lies, is granting for the moment that these neurological structures, so the reticular activating system of the brainstem, the cortex, do the things that you or other scientists say they do, carry signals and so forth, represent colors in the world. How mechanically does this at all produce the subjective sense of feeling or the qualia? You used the word intrinsic earlier, and maybe we could just unpack what that intrinsic means a bit more, or maybe it's just not reducible any further. It just is. But I think that's a nice way on which to end.
Sure. Let me begin by saying that I think the sense of puzzlement that comes with the hard problem would never have arisen had we started addressing the question of the physical basis of consciousness by looking at raw feeling. I think it's only because we started in the wrong place with a function that isn't intrinsically conscious that we became puzzled about, well, why is this thing conscious? Because it doesn't seem to need to be conscious. Its mechanism doesn't demand it or explain it. So had we started with raw feeling, I don't think anybody would ever have formulated the problem. I think the problem just doesn't arise. Why does the mechanism that generates feeling feel like something? You just say, duh, what do you mean? Of course, the mechanism of feeling feels like something. I want to also add, for the sake of clarity, that my metaphysical position, and I think anybody working in neuropsychology has to have a metaphysical position on the mind-body problem because it is a metaphysical problem. And my metaphysical position is that of a dual aspect monist. So I don't think that the physiological goings-on in the brain produce the conscious experience in the same way that the liver produces bile. I don't think consciousness is excreted by neurons. I think that there's an underlying mechanism, that's the monist mechanism, which explains the two sets of observable data, the objective perspective on the behavior of the brain and the subjective perspective on the being of that same thing. So I think that these are two different ways in which we can observe, two different observational perspectives upon one and the same mechanism. So it's crucial to answering your question that you understand what I mean by intrinsic. I mean that this is a mechanism described in the language of mathematics. Galileo wonderfully said, the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. I emphasize that it's this abstract language. It's not a physiological language or a psychological language. It's an abstract, it's a language of in which you can articulate the laws that govern both sets of observables. You need one set of laws that govern both sets of observables. And so what I've been trying to articulate in the Hidden Spring is the mechanism, the causal mechanism, the lawful causal mechanism that generates, that gives rise to a system that has to monitor its own state in the ways that I've just described. It's a self-organizing system. That is to say, it's a homeostatic system that is acting intentionally in order to achieve desired outcomes. It's a self-organizing system which distinguishes itself from its environment because it has to, otherwise you can't function homeostatically. You need to sequester yourself from the environment in order to maintain your existence separately from the environment. You can't just equalize with the environment. You have to maintain, for example, your body temperature, not equalize with the one outside, etc. So it's a self-organizing system which is monitoring its own states in matters that are existentially consequential for the system, and those states are just intrinsically valence. They just necessarily are good or bad for the system, and they must be categorical variables because we have multiple needs of that existential kind. And when you describe such a system, you have just described a system that feels like something. If you allow yourself to take the viewpoint of the system, that's an absolutely fundamental point. I think that that's the Rubicon we have to cross. I'm glad we started our conversation in the way that we did, because I said what frustrated me about the neuroscience of the 1980s that I was trained in was that we only treat the brain as an object. We don't treat it as a subject. We thereby leave out not only half the picture, but the most interesting half of the picture. So if you allow yourself as a scientist to accept that there is such a thing as the point of view of the system, then some systems feel like something and some systems do not. And systems that feel like something have the dynamics that I've just described. That's what I mean by the intrinsic mechanism of feeling.